Tonight's session is called The Election of 1860. I'm very pleased to be joined from his office in New Orleans, I believe, in Louisiana, Jonathan Earl, who's the Roger Hadfield Ogden Dean of the LSU Honors College, and more importantly, it seems to me, the Associate Professor of History at Louisiana State University and an excellent teacher, which is the credibility you bring, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to Libby and Mike and Hannah, other people on this team for setting this up. It's really impressive, the organization, the number of people who are here. I've already got a great question that I can't wait to answer. So thanks a lot for inviting me. And, you know, most things during this pandemic are decidedly worse, let's just admit it. But this kind of webinar is one of those things that I think is making the world a better place. People I'm noticing are here from all over the country. We didn't have to leave our houses. We can have a beverage of our choice by our side and relax and hear a little bit about the election of 1860. Maybe you could just do me a favor, though, and imagine that we are in the beautiful atrium of the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. And there's going to be a nice wine and cheese situation afterwards, and we can all talk amongst ourselves, because that's really what I miss, is that kind of interaction. My wife, Leslie Tuttle, who's also a scholar, and I were in residence at the Humanities Center in 2010, 2011, I guess it was, which, gosh, that's a long time ago. I was finishing a book on Bleeding Kansas, and Leslie was starting a book that she's finishing now, and it's just a wonderful place for those of you who have never been there. It's a place that actually nourishes scholars and scholarship. They feed you, they give you a beautiful office with a balcony, they get you whatever books and materials you need. It's just one of the great things about being a humanities scholar is going and visiting the National Humanities Center. So I'm delighted to do my little part of giving back tonight, Andy, with this little talk. I'm delighted to be interrupted if there's a good question. I'm going to be speaking from an outline, so there's no script that I need to stick to. So let's just get right to it. First, let me start with, I guess, congratulations, which are in order. We're right now in the home stretch of what's likely the most unusual and contentious presidential election of our lifetimes. I'm sure you, like me, are doom scrolling all the time and checking polls, or at least reading the newspaper if you're not a political junkie like I am. Passionate supporters of both candidates, let me get in here. That's what I want. Of both candidates have been quick to point out that if the other candidate prevails, either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, the very republic might not even survive this election. Frankly, this isn't all that new in American history. There have been other times when the future of the republic seemed at stake and partisans made the same claims we're seeing now. One thing that came to mind when I was preparing this talk is the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson's followers, for example, were convinced that the Federalists, the members of the opposing party, were really monarchists in disguise, and the freedoms won by the Patriots in the Revolution might well be extinguished if President John Adams was allowed another term. And the Federalists, especially the High Federalists personified by Alexander Hamilton, everyone's current favorite founding father, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, were absolutely sure that if Jefferson wins, blood would run in the streets of Philadelphia just as it had in Paris during their revolution. Both sides, I think, in this case, were wrong. At the first ever orderly transfer of power from one party to another took place without violence or a coup d'etat or a descent into dictatorship in 1801. May we again be so lucky. And I love that this quote that I found from a newspaper tells a partisan what might be expected if Jefferson was elected. Jefferson and no God. God would be banished if Jefferson were brought to the White House. Didn't happen. This brings me to the pivotal election of 1860. I'm going to bring this map back at the end of my talk because I want to really kind of dive into it. I know we all see lots of maps on CNN during election night or whatever station you're partial to. This is the subject of a forthcoming book I'm writing for Oxford University Press's Pivotal Moments in U.S. History series, which, frankly, the audience is exactly you, the people listening to me tonight. Excited, educated readers of history who are not professional scholars. So if I'm hitting you at your level, that's good. And if I'm not, please let me know, and I'm going to be sure to put that into my revisions. People living through the election of 1860 and the decade of the 1850s, which led to it, were correct in this case, that the very republic was at stake. The future of the United States, or even, as Abraham Lincoln said 3 years later, democracy on our planet, government of the people, by the people, for the people, really was in doubt this time. And the question I think really put before the voters that year was, what kind of country would we be? Would we be slave? Would we be free? Would we be two countries sharing a 3,000-mile uneasy border? Imagine building a wall on that border. Or remain one nation, indivisible. And we look at this election, all of us here tonight, 160 years in the future, knowing the outcome of that 1860 election and not knowing the outcome of the election we're living through now. So that's kind of the moment I want to strike for us right now. And we know what happened in 1860, and we know its aftermath. The right guy, in my opinion, won that election, albeit with a paltry share of the popular vote. You can see in the upper right-hand pie chart that Lincoln only got 39% of the popular vote in the election of 1860, while doing pretty darn well in the Electoral College. Almost 60% of the electoral votes went to Lincoln. We can talk about some parallels between that and our current situation at the end of the talk. And of course, after Lincoln won the election, the South refused to abide by those results, and 7 states in the South seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America before Lincoln even took the oath of office in the following May. After that, of course, we know that a terrible civil war ensued where 750,000 men lost their lives. And after that war, it was made clear that we would actually, in fact, endure as a nation indivisible without slavery at the core of the economies of, if we're being honest, both the North and the South. But did this election of 1860 really have to come out this way? Would the sectional crisis of the 1850s, would the Civil War have looked any different if Abraham Lincoln, say, had lost the Republican nomination in 1860 to better known candidates, or if he had fallen short in the general election that year? He didn't, of course, but historians who've moved well beyond what I'll call old-fashioned providential or deterministic interpretations. These are interpretations of history that were put forward by great writers like St. Augustine, like Karl Marx. He was big into the deterministic role of history. And historians have really started to concede the role of what I'm going to call contingency. If you write down a word tonight, if you write down a single word, I would say write down the word contingency, and we can talk about it more. Contingency in history is still often make the mistake of presenting the past as if it was all meant to happen just this way. So even historians that concede that contingency is real still sometimes write about history as if, duh, of course Lincoln was going to win. Of course the Civil War was going to come out the way it did. Of course that fully realized, self-realized boy born in that Kentucky log cabin would make it to the White House at the moment of the nation's severest crisis. Of course he would, against considerable odds, prevail in a civil war and prevent government for the people, by the people, from perishing from the earth. But let's put on another hat now. As observers of elections, including our current one, we know that's not the way history or politics or reality works. Even chance occurrences at pivotal moments can and do affect large historical forces and yield momentous consequences. And here I'm talking about viruses or hurricanes or flies during a debate or abandoned laptops or hot mics. This is part of what to me makes history so darn interesting. One never knows what twists and turns will turn a humdrum story on its head. So I'm going to get to an argument here. Emphasizing the contingency of events can help historians return human agency, free will, and even decision-making to a central place in the writing and teaching of history. And I know many of you are teachers. At least that's what I'm hoping to do in my book, which attempts to put voters at the center of the narrative. Voters making probably the most important decision voters made in the history of the Republic up to that point. So in fact, scholars of elections, and especially contentious elections like this one and ours, have even more reason to invest meaning in historical contingency. Determinism, whether providential, God says so, or dialectical, like Marx would write about, or anything else, is, in my opinion, frustrating and inherently anti-democratic. These types of interpretations assume that even in free elections, the voter's choice, the voter's free will is preordained. And we all know that in unfree canvases like those in places like Russia or North Korea, victories are often predetermined in elections, luckily not in ours. This type of rear window predictability is precisely why many historians of politics often do write about the political and electoral outcomes of the past, even those that were demonstrably chaotic and volatile. And again, as you're teaching your students about elections, try to make it exciting and emphasize the idea that anything could have happened. Things could have come out differently. I think history is inherently interesting, to me at least, and for students who say history is boring, it's because sometimes we write it as if it was all meant to happen exactly the way it happened. And this isn't just boring and sad because it turns students off from history, but I think it's also bad history. Let me give you an example. This is a textbook that I actually use for undergraduates in the U.S. History Survey I teach, which I wouldn't assign if it wasn't pretty good. But it makes it seem that the sudden, even shocking emergence of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 Republican nominating contest was just an obvious, inevitable event, that he was a shoo-in, the most probable thing in the world. I'm going to quote now from The American Promise by James Rourke and other historians. Republicans, it says, cast about for a moderate candidate to go with their even-handed platform. Lincoln, since bursting onto the national scene, had demonstrated his clear purpose, good judgment, and solid Republican credentials. That and his residence in Illinois, a crucial state, made him attractive to his party. On the third ballot, the delegates chose Lincoln. Defeated by Stephen Douglas in a state contest less than 2 years earlier, Lincoln now stood ready to take him on for the presidency. End quote. So, if residents in the great state of Illinois and solid GOP credentials were all it took to be nominated in 1860, surely the pool of available candidates was kind of large. And why then did it take Lincoln until the third ballot if he already possessed these essential qualities in spades? My research into the election of 1860 shows that precisely the opposite was true. This was a particularly chaotic and unpredictable moment in U.S. politics. And again, here's the same word. Contingency affected events at nearly every stage of the process, from the nominees themselves to the choice of the locations of party conventions to strategies employed by all four of the major candidates. The fact is that no seasoned observer in any political party would have considered our hero of the evening, Abraham Lincoln, a favorite for the presidency in 1860 at the beginning of the campaign. In fact, I found through the National Humanities Center when I was there, a compendium of biographical sketches by D.W. Bartlett of 21 likely presidential candidates, again, published in 1859, that didn't bother to include a sketch on Abraham Lincoln. Wasn't a factor. More to the point, from the vantage point of, say, 1850, few people could have foreseen that a sectionally based, that means a party based in one section of the country, a sectionally based anti-slavery party would be a contender for control of any single branch of the U.S. government. Fewer still would have predicted a serious secessionist movement or a civil war over the issue of slavery and its expansion. So I see a question there about candidates. Is that what you want me to answer, Andy?
Yeah, let me bring that in. And I also want to, we're still on slide 23. That's where you
Correct.
intend to be, correct? Yep. So this question is from Lou, who's actually a former teacher advisory council member. Hey, Lou, it's good to see you again. Lou's in upstate New York in Utica, I believe. Lou is asking, just for some clarification, so there were more than 4 candidates for this election, correct?
Correct. Well, good question. There were 4 major candidates that got electoral votes. And you could, again, in the 19th century, you didn't have a ballot that was printed by your Secretary of State in your state. You turned in a ballot that was printed by your local political party. And you could have all sorts of names on that list. So if you were, let's say you were a Texas Republican, there weren't too many of them, you couldn't even find a ballot for Abraham Lincoln to turn in. So these were the 4 candidates that were major candidates and that won electoral votes in the election. But I'll bet there were votes cast for hundreds or thousands of people during the election. So Lou's question is awesome.
And because we're in the context we're in, let me ask this clarified question, which is what you're describing, particularly Lincoln not being included in the top 25 or 30, however many.
Yeah.
That wasn't intentional. That wasn't a motive to keep him off the ballot. He wasn't making the cut, correct?
He wasn't a factor. Lincoln had, in his political career, served one completely undistinguished term in the U.S. Congress in the 1840s. He didn't even get renominated by his party after his term expired. He was a Whig. And he'd gone back home to Illinois, and frankly, he'd done a pretty nice job at making some money. He'd become a very successful lawyer for railroads in Illinois. He made some money. He bought a nice house, but he always yearned to get back into politics. So I don't blame D.W. Bartlett for not including Lincoln in that compendium. He just wasn't a major factor. If that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you.
Excellent question. Keep interrupting me because I can get going on this stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, back to this kind of vantage point of 10 years before the election. I don't think anybody could have conceived again of a sectional election. I think far likelier, if you'd asked an 1850 citizen to prognosticate, he would have said, or she would have said, the conflict might happen between the industrial West and the industrial East and the agrarian West, or Protestant nativists versus Catholic immigrants. Immigration was a huge issue in the 1850s, but a rending of the Union over slavery was just beyond what most people who was not a radical abolitionist or a fire-eating secessionist would have thought possible. So the story of the election of 1860 is inherently tied up with the story of what I'm calling historical contingency, how the unlikely event of a sectional presidential election, one that brought to the White House this one-term kind of second-string congressman who hadn't won an election since 1846, how this could have occurred at the very most profound moment in our political history. And it's because of this that butterfly effects, you've heard that term, I'm sure, can and often do morph into very real tornadoes that change the way people live their lives, 160 years later. So the rest of my remarks tonight will be describing a few moments of contingency when events during this very important campaign took turns that few people could have ever anticipated. I'm going to talk about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and the profound effect it had on presidential politics. I'm going to talk about the story of three very different nominating conventions in the spring of 1860. And then I'm going to talk about the way Lincoln and his campaign won the presidential canvass by targeting voters in what they called the doubtful states, what we would today call battleground states. Then there's going to be plenty of time for your questions, while also discussing, I hope, some ways that the election we're currently experiencing has some parallels and even some stark differences to what happened more than a century and a half ago. So let's get started with the map immediately preceding the election of 1860, 1856. This map, if you're paying attention, looks a little bit different from the earlier map that I showed about 1860. And it's mostly that upper north stays in the blue category, that Democratic category. In 1856, the GOP, which I guess for my lecture tonight, we should probably call the Grand New Party, because it was brand new in 1856. It didn't win its first presidential election that year, but it came awfully close. The candidate that year was a political neophyte named John C. Fremont. If you like NPR, Steve Inskeep, the Morning Edition host, has a nice biography of John and Jesse Fremont. And he captured all but 5 of the northern states that year. Anybody who paid attention to this map could see that flipping 3 or even the right 2 of the states won by President James Buchanan in 1856 would deliver the presidency to the Republicans without the need of a single Southern ballot. So that's kind of what I want to get you thinking about. Like, people see in both Mississippi and in New York that, hey, wait, someone can be elected president with votes from only one section of the country. And if you don't mind, Andy, I'm going to go right to the question here about, is it possible for a new party to emerge? In the 1850s, it was, because of the demise of one of the 2 major parties, the Whigs, which had never really gotten their political footing except being a party that was against the Democratic Party, which was the dominant party. There are times when new parties can emerge. And I would argue we're in one that it could happen again. Not this year, but let's say there's a big split in the way Republicans vote this time. I could see a new party emerging in the center, for example. So in this case, you have a brand new party, the Republicans, who have almost all their support from one section of the country, the North. And they're uniting voters in the Northeast, New England, and the Northwest, places like Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They're really making inroads into these free state, marginally anti-slavery voters. So yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, and before you move on, it's a little bit of a sideways question, but maybe not. Besides, Aaron is typing this in from Vietnam, so I need to ask it.
Nice.
And that is, describe to us how news moved around at this time. How did the nation hear about Harper's Ferry and other kinds of things? Was there a delay of information? Did things occur, weeks before that news actually, as a butterfly, impacted the reality of the moment?
That's an awesome question. So the revolution in communications that happened in the 1840s, so in that antebellum period, was akin to what has happened in our lifetimes with this crazy thing we call the internet. Before the invention of the telegraph in 1842, 1843, the fastest information could travel was the speed of a fast horse. And all of a sudden, once you have telegraph lines, information can travel at literally the speed of light. So where there are telegraph stations, word can travel very, very quickly. Word from Harper's Ferry, for example, could get to Washington very, very quickly. And even after John Brown, who I'm going to talk about in a second, cut the telegraph line, word still got to Washington, D.C. from Harper's Ferry because the B&O Railroad got there in a little over an hour. So we're in a period in the antebellum times of very rapid technological change. I would say even dizzying technological change that allows information to occur very quickly. Newspapers are published often twice a day. They contain information from newspapers in other parts of the country that happen sometimes just the day before, sometimes a week before. But news in especially the North and the Northwest travels very, very quickly. The South is a little bit different. There's less telegraph wire, there's less technology, but there are times when information can be lightning fast, and there are times when information can be lost. And maybe I'll bring that up again when we talk about John Brown, who took full advantage of this new way to get in touch with people. So that question came from Vietnam, is that right?
It did, which is ironic given your answer. It's coincidental. Yeah. But you may or may not be able to answer this, but I wonder if what you described, essentially being on the other end of the wires, much like the railroad as it moved across the country. If you were on the railroad, fantastic. If you were not on it, there was an information desert. So I wonder if you could map some of the voting reactions according to access to communication and information the way you described it.
I could. I mean, it's a hard question, and it really did. You could be in, and I wrote an article about this once, in Kansas territory, where John Brown spent some time before his Harper's Ferry raid, and you could be just a day's ride out of Lawrence, Kansas, which was just a day's ride from the nearest telegraph, which was up at Fort Leavenworth, and news might not reach you for weeks. Yeah. So it could be, even though you're close, it can be a really long way to get news. John Brown, for example, tried to get to the Free State town of Lawrence, Kansas to avenge or at least to stop the attack on that town in 1856, and he was too late. He got there after the Free State Hotel was knocked down and after people had been murdered by pro-slavery settlers coming across from Missouri. So he took his own action at Pottawatomie Creek to try to avenge that. So really, historical events are affected in a contingent way by the speed of information. Now, voters, we all have known, it's in the Constitution that the election is held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That was a ritual by 1860. Everyone knew when Election Day was. We have polling places that are pretty well spread out so that you could get there in less than a day with a team of horses. So you'd be amazed, everyone listening to this call, how orderly and how normal an election day actually was. There are parts of it that you'd find very, very comforting and familiar. There are other parts you might find unfamiliar. There was a lot of alcohol involved and kind of vote bribing. And again, that part where you don't fill out the same ballot as someone in the party that you're voting against. So it's making sure that you have that right ballot to turn in was a big deal. But other parts of it would be very, very familiar. Does that answer your question a little bit, Andy? And I can get back to it.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Outstanding. So let's fast forward a couple years after the election of 1856. Leading candidates that are in that compendium that I got at the National Humanities Center were people like the presumed standard bearer, William Henry Seward. I'll show pictures of these guys. Ohio's Governor Salmon Chase, Pennsylvania's ethically challenged Senator Simon Cameron, House Speaker Nathaniel Banks, and maybe let's just throw Lincoln in for good fun, mentioned almost exclusively at this point as a vice presidential potential candidate, felt confident that 4 years after 1856, the Republicans were going to win. All they had to do was pick up a couple of states and have a different outcome than in 1856. So numbers and demography, they felt, were on their side. I hope this sounds a little bit familiar, because I hear that a lot about the Democratic Party, that, just this next election, Texas is going to turn blue again. But not so fast. Historical contingency rarely works so neatly, and inevitability rarely is. This is one of my favorite pictures of all time. This is Jacob Lawrence's fine art description of John Brown entering the city of Harper's Ferry with pikes. He did these during the Harlem Renaissance. And when John Brown entered the sleeping town of Harper's Ferry to take over the federal arsenal in 1859, this spectacular and really astonishing raid contained the very real potential to completely upend an election that looked like it was heading the Republicans' way. Real potential damage to the Republicans at the polls, and perhaps permanently damaging this very new party. We just talked about how brand new the party was. So it also unleashed potentially untamable forces like slave insurrections, like disunion, even race war into the mix of something that could happen during the election. And now I'm thinking very much like what happened in our previous summer, the murder of George Floyd, which unleashed very large protest marches and counter marches, and no one, well, not no one. It was hard to see that would be the focus of our politics during the summer of 2020. Is the kind of parallel I want to make. To put it simply, forces unleashed by John Brown overwhelmed unionist efforts in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and weakened candidates that had heretofore seemed like very strong candidates. Let me talk about a few of them now. Southern newspapers recall, like I said, there was not really a Republican Party in the South outside of a few border state outposts, thought that what happened with John Brown and in Harper's Ferry were simply the logical, inevitable outcome of Republican agitation over slavery. Republicans wanted to restrict the expansion of slavery. They were not abolitionists. They wanted to stop slavery where it was. Here's a quotation from the Baltimore Sun, near where I grew up. Heretofore, the voice of border state moderation, which sounds like a radical fire-eating newspaper after John Brown. Here's what they said. The South could not afford to live under a government the majority of whose subjects or citizens regard John Brown as a martyr and a Christian hero, rather than a murderer and a robber. Other newspapers wrote panicked editorials and delivered withering public comments, circling back again on one figure in particular, the guy on your screen right now, William Seward, a senator from New York, who perhaps unfairly became the face of the Republican defenders of John Brown and his violent actions. Here's a quote from the Richmond Enquirer that I like a lot. Brown may be insane, wrote the editor of the Enquirer, but there are other criminals, guilty wretches, who instigated the crime perpetrated at Harper's Ferry. Bring Seward to the jurisdiction of Virginia, and Brown and his deluded victims in the Charlestown jail may hope for a pardon. So in other words, kind of a lock him up type of chant getting started in places like Richmond and Baltimore for a senator from New York whose politics were not that different from Lincoln's, but he was a national figure. He had given a big speech in the Senate that was an abolitionist speech called the Higher Law Speech. And here we have a real weakening of someone like Seward. In November 1859, here's another parallel I want to have everyone think about. a group calling itself the New York Vigilant Committee held a convention where speakers literally competed with each other to make the strongest claims about John Brown's deep-seated republicanism. John Brown, by the way, never voted. He never joined a party. Here's one speaker at this rally, which I want you to think of as a Trump rally. Quote, "The principle on which John Brown and his allies acted is the exact same which has been proclaimed by the leaders of the Republican Party, especially Senator Seward. According to speakers at this meeting, Brown and his men were simply, quote, the misguided, guilty tools of more subtle and dangerous men, men like Seward, men like Horace Greeley, men like Thurlow Weed." So what's poor Senator Seward to do when they're basically chanting, "Lock him up," in a New York City rally? Again and again, Seward tried to distance himself from Brown. He denounced the raid. He denounced Brown's radicalism. He did not tell John Brown's supporters to stand by and stand down. Seward and his allies, in my opinion, bent over backwards to reassure the South that, quote, "by Constitution and laws, slavery is recognized and tolerated. It was a compact made by our fathers and one that binds their heirs. We will oppose both slavery's extension into the West and its encroachments," wrote the editor of the Seward-friendly newspaper, the Albany Evening Journal. What I want you to remember is that none of this worked. Even before Brown was executed in December 1859, it was clear that Northeastern Seward Republicans in the Republican Party and Stephen Douglas, who I'll talk about in a second, his centrist Democrats were in line to pay a steep political price for John Brown's actions. And the establishment candidates in both parties were on the defensive. Talk a little bit about Stephen Douglas, who I love that cartoon that Andy started us off with. He was really short compared to Lincoln, 5'3", so compared to Lincoln's 6'3" or 4. I'm going to try to get a little literary here. Even if it was like that initial gash in the Titanic's hull barely felt at the time, Seward's run for the presidency was, in my opinion, dealt what amounted to a fatal blow when John Brown came to Harper's Ferry. Here's a quote from a journalist named James Pike, recalling that he had a very strong belief that Seward's nomination was secure till Mr. Brown visited Virginia. That little incident threw a cloud over the presidential talk and I think obscured his prospects not a little. So not many people understood at the time, but I'm going to say right here that the biggest beneficiary of Brown's raid turned out to be Abraham Lincoln, who as a candidate made Seward appear more radical than he was. So then you have Lincoln and his lieutenants, mostly in Illinois, using every scrap of contingency they could find to take advantage of this in a few brilliant moves in 1860. One of them was to stage a convention for the first time in the bustling city of Chicago. I know a lot of you are from Chicago, it looked like from the chat that I was looking at before. Chicago was the beating heart of the western battleground state of Illinois, where Stephen Douglas is also from. In many ways, the choice of Chicago for the Republican convention made no sense. I think far more obvious choices that year would have been established western or border towns like Cincinnati in Ohio, Louisville on the Ohio River and in Kentucky, or St. Louis, right where the Missouri and the Mississippi River collide. But the vote to hold this convention in Chicago came down to one vote, and it was cast by a Lincoln backer, a judge named David Davis. So the convention for the Republicans is going to be in Chicago. Then, in turn, in a move that I think has been underplayed by previous historians, Lincoln's team carefully engineered a unanimous vote in the weeks preceding the meeting in Chicago at the Illinois State Republican Convention that made Lincoln the favorite son of this convention. He was going to be the guy, the hometown guy, the favorite son. And I think this was a really significant move that made Lincoln's nomination way more likely than it maybe would have been already. By contrast, other big Republicans end up at the Chicago Convention, which was held, I've got a picture of it, in the Wigwam. They used to build buildings purpose-made for conventions that they would then take down afterwards. So they built this large lecture hall. It would be completely COVID unfriendly. with bleachers, with loud galleries, with a rostrum where you could give speeches. Everybody arrived at the wigwam in 1860, and Lincoln's surrogates, Lincoln wasn't there. He stayed home in Springfield, which is what you did when you were a candidate. You stayed away from the convention. Basically cajoled and entertained and horse traded their way to offering their candidate, Lincoln, as the preferred second choice of numerous drunken and sleep-deprived delegates in attendance. So once top-tier candidates like Seward, who I've talked about, like Solomon Chase, like a Missouri lawyer named Edward Bates faltered, it was Lincoln who shockingly emerged as a nominee on the third ballot in Chicago. So again, I think there was a lot of contingency during the convention that probably should have never even happened in Chicago, but it did, and Lincoln was the guy who took advantage of it. What's more, the new dark horse Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, faced a Democratic Party that was woefully split on sectional lines. Let's talk about what happened to Stephen Douglas. I might have put his slide in the wrong space there, so I'll go back to him. In the wake of intra-party dust-ups over slavery, Douglas, who was Lincoln's old rival, I mean, imagine how deep this is. Lincoln and Douglas have known each other since they were opposing lawyers in Illinois. They tried to date the same girl who ended up marrying Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln. So they've known each other for years. They ran against each other for the Senate in 1858. Lincoln lost that Senate campaign to Stephen Douglas. It was actually an election for state delegates who chose senators before the 20th century. So Douglas was the guy. He was the national political figure. Lincoln was just a guy who had run against him. But Lincoln's old rival, Stephen Douglas, had made himself by 1860, his name was Mud in the Deep South, for opposing a pro-slavery state constitution in Kansas and for suggesting as part of his pro-sovereignty, popular sovereignty pitch, that if a state's residents deemed slavery wrong, they could keep it out. So what most people consider a compromise on slavery, popular sovereignty, people in the Deep South consider a slap against slavery, that it could be potentially outlawed in places where it exists. And a growing number of Southern Democrats were calling for making slavery a national institution in 1860, saying, why not have slavery in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania? You can take a horse there, you can take other personal property. Why not allow slaveholders to take their human property to northern states? Once again, where is the convention going to be for the Democrats? Just as I think it was an amazing coincidence for Lincoln that the Republicans meet in Chicago, I think it was a terrible blow to Stephen Douglas that the Democrats chose Charleston, South Carolina, the epicenter of secessionism, the most pro-slavery city in the entire country. Forgive me if you know the joke from the 19th century that a South Carolinian senator named James Pettigrew said that his state was tragically too small for a republic and too large for an insane asylum. When I watched the debate between Senator Lindsey Graham and his challenger, Jamie Harrison, I thought again of James Pettigrew and that weird place, South Carolina. Imagine this being the place for the Democratic Party to meet. It did not go well for our friends, the Democrats. Douglas was really the only candidate that had a chance, even a small chance, of winning votes in every section of the country, north, south, east, west. But Douglas's pro-slavery opponents denied him what you needed at the Democrats' convention. For a long time, you needed 2/3 of the vote of the delegates to get nominated. Douglas had a majority, but not this supermajority of 2/3 to emerge the nominee. The convention adjourned in deadlock. They didn't choose a nominee. They didn't choose a platform. So a second convention, if you can believe this, was called for Baltimore a few weeks later. And the rest of the convention, the Rump Convention, ends up supporting this guy, the Vice President of the United States, John C. Breckinridge, age 36, from Kentucky. So here we are. We're starting to get a mess on our hands. As if this isn't chaotic enough, old-line border state Whigs in states like Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and Maryland refused to follow Whigs like Seward and Lincoln, who had entered the anti-slavery Republican Party. They assembled as constitutional unionists and nominated John Bell of Tennessee for president on their ticket. So we have more like 2016 than 2020, 4 candidates for the presidency. And I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions about these 4 candidates, where we are. And I love that someone, I guess that's Margie, who I owe another answer to, but I'm going to answer your question later, Margie, knows that Mud, there's an origin of the story that someone's name is Mud, and it's from the aftermath of the assassination of Lincoln. We can get to that as well. So any questions for me now, Andy, or people listening along?
Yeah, let's pause for a moment and give folks a chance to type some questions again into the Ask Professor Earl section or tab of your lower left-hand corner of your screen. And while folks are getting those questions out, Jonathan, let me ask you this. Talk to us a little bit, if it's not too mechanical or too ephemeral, talk to us a little bit about the individuals and or the machines that made the choices you've described. So what I mean to say is, from now, we will likely know the names of political operatives who made choices in 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020. We'll know Karl Rove and Ronna McDaniel and the people who are in charge of deciding where conventions are held. How did that happen in 1860? Who were the people who made the choice to go to Charleston? And do we not know them because it was such a bad choice, or was that more of a consensus operation than it is now?
It's such a great question. Okay, so we do know who their names. They're not major figures, but I have actually spent a lot of time not on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side, researching the chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1860. And he was a banker that actually wrote personal checks to cover things like newspapers. Does that make sense? Like now, of course, we raise money from candidates and we raise money from PACs and super PACs. So there is a class of Americans, I think let's affectionately call them political hacks, who are journalists, who are party office holders. They're people who go after the spoils after an election. And in the case, let me go back to, instead of Charleston, the Chicago one, there's a judge by the name of David Davis, who is an old friend of Lincoln and who is Lincoln's surrogate on the scene during all of these pre-convention machinations. He's the one who whispers in people's ear that Lincoln, Lincoln will take care of you if you vote for him on the second ballot or the third ballot. Lincoln himself, by the way, was not even there and could plausibly maintain that he was pure as the driven snow. He never promised any delegate anything. But there were these professional political hacks in every party that made these decisions. And the fact of the matter is the center of gravity in the Democratic Party in 1860 was moving more south and more toward the secessionist persuasion. Secessionists were still radical, just like abolitionists were on the northern side, but you pretty much had to have the support of some pretty radical pro-slavery folks by 1860 to be the nominee. Right. James Buchanan is a good example. James Buchanan is not a Southerner. He's from Pennsylvania. He was conveniently the ambassador to the court of St. James in London during the previous 4 years. So he hadn't been involved in some of the big intra-party fights, but he was the most pro-slavery president I can imagine between 1857 and 1861. He was a Northern man with Southern principles. So even though you have these Van Burens and these Pierces and these Buchanans, they are the slaveholders' friend. So most people will be like, hey, yeah, Charleston, great idea. It's got nice weather. There's some good restaurants down there. But if you're Stephen Douglas, this is a disaster.
And he had no input, clearly. So. And
he had no input. Hey, so this is a good chance to mention about Stephen Douglas. He was not a traditional politician. He hit the hustings himself. He went on speaking tours. He showed up places that candidates in the 19th century were not supposed to go. You're supposed to stay on your front porch, receive guests, kind of pretend and demur that you were even interested in pursuing an office. That was considered unseemly in the 19th century. Now we have these ambitious candidates who have to, basically get out there and raise money and cajole you into voting for them. I find it just astonishing. Let's spend the next, I'm almost finished here, maybe 10 minutes talking about the canvass in the fall, because this is another place where contingency, and in this case, Lincoln's political acumen really changed the events. Lincoln men, and I'm going to include in this category of Lincoln Man Lincoln himself, because he was very active, even if he was hanging out in his law office in Springfield, ran a brilliant campaign, especially in these key states of Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, where he carefully parsed out funds, he parsed out the most persuasive speakers, and he seeded new Republican newspapers in challenging markets. They played up local issues where Republican platform planks would be popular. I don't know if anyone noticed during the vice presidential debate last week that we all of a sudden heard a lot about fracking. I hadn't heard anyone mention fracking the whole campaign, but speaking in that case, both Vice President Pence and Senator Harris, two people in Pennsylvania who care a lot about the fracking issue, whereas I'm in Louisiana, we don't frack here. So Republicans were great at playing up local issues where Republicans' platform planks would be popular. So in this way, really just a handful of counties in the states of Indiana and Pennsylvania became kind of ground zero for the election of 1860. I should have mentioned this the first time I mentioned them. We talk about these states now as battleground states, which is a very martial metaphor. I love that in the 19th century, these are doubtful states, which is a religious metaphor. It's when you don't know, whether you're a Methodist or whether you believe in God, you're doubting. But now, of course, it's all about warfare. And as it is in 2020, Pennsylvania was a major prize during 1860, one that eluded the Republicans 4 years earlier in 1856, but looked more promising 4 years later. And here, just like I just talked about fracking, a little protectionist tariff inserted into the GOP platform helped unite the state's German farmers, its artisans in Philadelphia, and its steel-producing factory owners, producing an electoral majority in the sitting president, James Buchanan's home state. So that's an example of using a local issue to win a national election. This left, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the fascinating state of Indiana. Okay, it's not much of a battleground state today, but it was in 1860. I'm going to talk about the same Lincoln guy, this gigantic plus-size judge named David Davis, the guy who got the convention to go to Chicago, was despondent about Indiana. He thought Republicans were going to lose Indiana, and he writes to Lincoln in September of 1860, Indiana is in great danger. I hope the National Committee will do all they can for the state. The whole money they asked, and more if it can be raised, should be sent at once. Men work better with money in hand. And I think that's like the most true political observation I've ever heard. Men work better with money in hand. Lincoln, back in Springfield, is pacing in his law office. He advised his Republican National Committee chair to double down on his investments in Indiana's state elections, which actually take place in October before the presidential. And this was the strategy. Let's show that a victory there would spur on Republicans in Illinois and other close states to carry us forward in November. And again, this is weird. These were places that were known as October states because they picked their governor and their state legislatures the first Tuesday after the first Monday in October. So you could get momentum. And it's better than any poll, right? Knowing how an actual election with the same voters took place one month before. So it's better than 538.com. And it's not a strategy without risk. These are resources that could have been expended in other ways, yet the whole surplus, I'm quoting again, the whole surplus energy of the party throughout the nation should be bent upon the October canvass in Indiana, Lincoln instructed. Bend all your energies on Indiana now. And then here's a nice detail that most people don't know. Should show Lincoln. Now, this is the Brady portrait of Lincoln. He recommended keeping the best German lecturers, Germans like Karl Schurz, who had immigrated to the United States after the failed revolutions in 1848 in Europe, to go canvass in Indiana full time. This paid off, as Donald Trump might say, bigly. While most German and Irish Catholics stuck with the Democrats that year, Karl Schurz, this is actually Lincoln here, but it's a German Lincoln piece of propaganda. Schurz was political catnip for the large number of German Protestants, many of whom were anti-slavery and kind of on the radical side. Every penny invested in these German newspapers and these German speakers paid large dividends, both for the Germans that they brought aboard the bandwagon for the Republican Party, and the decidedly anti-nativist sheen that it gave the Republicans, who had heretofore been really known as an anti-immigration party. Lincoln was never anti-immigration, I might add. So Lincoln could read the tea leaves as well as anyone. He wrote his partner, his law partner, William Herndon, that it is entirely certain that Pennsylvania and Indiana have gone Republican very largely. Stephen Douglas saw it too. Stephen Douglas sees what happens in these gubernatorial elections in Indiana and Pennsylvania and says, Lincoln is the next president. We must try to save the Union. I will go south. And this to me is Douglas's great moment. He quits running for president himself. He knows he's going to lose, and he tries to help keep the Union together and argue against voting for Breckinridge. So in this way, Douglas became a last-minute Lincoln Project surrogate, like today's Rick Wilson's and Steve Schmidt's and George Conway's in the current campaign. Really, really interesting. So the contest over the voters in the doubtful states was what sealed, I think, the pivotal election for Lincoln and his Republicans. Let me close this part of my talk with another cartoon. I love the one, Andy, that you chose of the foot race with Lincoln's rail fence, but another cartoon that I think, again, there's also a lot of racism in this cartoon. But let's close with this visual document, a political cartoon that is entitled The Political Quadrille, music by Dred Scott. I really see this cartoon as a perfect visual representation of various contingencies in the election, showing the various moving parts almost in motion. I don't know who the cartoonist is. He is unknown to us, but he's placed, as we professional historians would, the slavery issue at the very center of the image, with Dred Scott, the plaintiff of the 1857 Supreme Court case that bears his name, himself striking up a tune on the violin. Around him, each of our four presidential candidates dance with a partner who represents each of the party's perceived allies, but also their potential liabilities. I'm going to start in the upper right hand and go clockwise. It's Abraham Lincoln dancing with a mulatto fancy, so someone that you could buy in a New Orleans slave market for sexual purposes. That's what a fancy slave was. Basically representing the specter of racial mixing for Lincoln and the Republicans. An Indian in the bottom right on the warpath, representing John Bell, who was an author of the 1830s Indian Removal Act. An offensive caricature of a drunken Irish immigrant dancing with Stephen Douglas. A lot of his votes came from Irish immigrants. And the devilish partner in the upper left of John Breckinridge dancing with William Lowndes Yancey, the fire-eating secessionist, who is portrayed as a man with devil's horns, or at least goat's horns. And that leads us back to the map.
So before you move on, Jonathan, if you don't mind, let's back up there. I've got a couple of questions about this cartoon, and I'm going to read the minds of some of our audience.
There are many.
Yeah, the first is just quickly, where did you get this image?
This is I found it in a book of political cartoons from the 19th century, and it's it was a fairly prominent one in the campaign. But what I'd love to hear our listeners tonight, who is this cartoon supporting? And I'm not sure I know the answer.
Yeah, right.
Is a Lincoln cartoon, like the one we started with, is a pro-Lincoln cartoon? Lincoln's striding toward victory, towards the Capitol. The slave is there in the fence, kind of lurking as a liability potentially for the dwarfish Stephen Douglas, who's got the Missouri Compromise pale kind of slowing him down. But this one, it's kind of an equal opportunity attacker of a cartoon.
Yeah. So my follow-up question, and I'm going to ask you to now put on your teacher hat, your educator hat. You work with students at LSU that likely were sitting in the classrooms of many of our audience members tonight. When you share this kind of work with college-age students, collegiate-level education, how do they respond to it, and how do you as an educator navigate the clear offensiveness of many of the images?
Exactly. Well, first of all, every person portrayed in this picture, besides the woman dancing with Lincoln and the man in the middle, was a white supremacist. So I think you have to preface everything with even Lincoln, who made incredible strides on the racial issue over the course of his political career. In 1860 he did not believe that black people and white people were social, political, or legal equals. He did believe that slavery was wrong and that black people had rights under the Declaration of Independence. So I think you have to, as an educator, put people into the mindset of 19th century Americans for whom white supremacy was the water they swam in, as if they were fish. And I think you basically, you warn them. You do a kind of a content warning. I don't like to use the word trigger warning because I think that's been really misused. But a content warning that we're going to see images in this class that are offensive to our 21st century eyes and that will upset many of you in class. And this one's an interesting one because I think in some ways the Irish character is in some ways the most caricatured and racist figure in some ways. The Dred Scott one, while has exaggerated features and is kind of striking a tune like a plantation slave, that Irish guy, I mean, this is why, I don't know if anyone here is from Notre Dame. I've never understood why Notre Dame keeps that mascot they have, because it speaks to very long-standing ethnically intolerant views of Irish people that make me sad.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And so then as a follow-up, and this might be an answer of, you might give a vignette as an answer, or you might just give a hypothetical, but given how you just framed it, how do your students then respond?
It's a good question. It's hard. We sometimes can't read our students' minds. I will very occasionally have a student come to me and say, I was upset by that. But if I do a good job at laying the groundwork and not surprising them and not presenting white supremacist imagery or anti-Irish imagery or anti-woman imagery as good or correct or what we think now. I mean, we're never going to be able to understand the past if we don't accept that they had very different views of racial equality and gender equality and ethnic equality that we do now. And it's a really difficult topic to navigate. Yeah. And again, we could pick cartoons that are less offensive to our modern eye. This one is kind of interesting to me because it shows so many of the things I've talked about tonight, especially that idea of contingency and of the chaos of this election. How would you pick this? How would you know how this one's going to come out looking at this cartoon? Who's going to be the victor? So it's a great question. And any other questions about this cartoon or questions about presenting disturbing or racist images to students? I mean, I think it's a disservice to keep them from them in some ways, to sanitize. But I also, for example, I would never show a picture of a lynching to a class. I think that's that kind of violence. And I mean, there were postcards made that people sent after lynchings. It's absolutely part of the political culture of the late 19th and much of the 20th century. But so I don't want to sanitize it, but I also don't want to hide it. If that makes any sense. Right.
And there are some things that are out of bounds, as you suggested, lynching, violence, but there are also other ways to evaluate sort of that moment in the past. So thank you for addressing that. And I would imagine that all of us make that choice when we choose the resources and curriculum that we address.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's one of the hardest things. I mean, we're historians. We know we want to learn more about that distant foreign country called the past, and that means interacting with people who have very different ideas than we do. And again, I think sometimes if we just assume erroneously that everyone has our post Martin Luther King views of racial equality, it would miss so much of what's going on. And this whole 2020 year has just brought that right back to the fore. And believe me, everyone listening, our students know that. Our students know that there are big issues with racial inequality and inequality in our justice system, and inequality in frankly in our elections. I mean, look where the big lines are for early voting. They're not in rural areas or white suburbs. They're in inner cities. Let me close. I'm going to shut up with the map, and I have tons of other maps if you want to see them. But again, I would love to talk a little bit about what are some parallels between our current electoral maps and this electoral map. I mean, one of the things that's obviously not a parallel is the Democrats, the blue states are now red states, and the red states in many ways are now blue states. So we've kind of done that switcheroo that people who if you ever follow Kevin Cruz on Twitter, he's one of my favorite historians to follow on Twitter. He loves to school people like Dinesh D'Souza who like to say, aren't the Democrats the party of the Ku Klux Klan and segregation? Well, yeah, they were. And they were the party of the Confederacy as well. But that has changed. Can I get to, I think it's Scott's question here. What did he say? If I understand you correctly, man's free will is necessary to understand political history. I would agree with that. How do you answer a question as why we should study history? I think that's because it's the study of humans and human folly and human choices. That's what gets me up in the morning, Scott, is learning what people in the past did and why they did it. And I hope that they wrote it down so I can look at what they did with historical evidence as well. So I don't claim to know truly what motivates everybody, but I think elections are a place to really see people making real world choices based on real world possibilities. And I think that's why elections are still fascinating to me today. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it actually, it very much does. Thank you. And just as a reminder, Jonathan, we have about 15 minutes or 16 minutes.
Okay, let me toss out for everyone. I'm going to start with the question that Armin Dane ISIF asked, but then I want to hear people talk about the Electoral College, because that is one of the parallels I see with both of these elections. That there's a sense that the Electoral College is making an election less democratic than if there were no Electoral College. But let's see about the 12th Amendment. So the 12th Amendment with the Electoral College, I should probably define what the 12th Amendment is. About all things not in the written Constitution returning to the states. Do I have the right amendment, Andy?
Yes.
Okay. Really, what a presidential election is? Yes. Yeah. What a presidential election is are, in our case, 50 different elections. In the case of 1860, 38 different elections. And one of the reasons why it pains me so much when I see our current president say that the Supreme Court might have to decide this election, that is not what our founders had in mind at all. Our founders had in mind each state deciding how to apportion their presidential electors in whatever matter, in whatever way they found suitable. South Carolina had the least democratic election in the country. I think state Senate chose the electors. Your popular vote was invisible in some states. So this idea that we have one national election, which is what most countries do, is not true in 1860, and it's in some ways not true today as well. So that's really all I know about that. And I'd love to hear some questions about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is designed by our founding fathers to do two things: to make sure that the rabble, meaning Andy, you, me, all the people listening to this call, unless you are a rich man, a property owner, a college-educated person, don't get to vote for president. You have a buffer layer where we have electors meet in an electoral college that hopefully they will choose the right person. Think George Washington. The other thing the Electoral College does is it makes close races seem not quite as close. So you see here, it makes in 1860, it makes an election where one man got only 39% of the votes. It makes him a pretty comfortable winner of a majority in that Electoral College. And every once in a while, the system fails and the popular vote winner, the person who wins a plurality of votes, sometimes does not win the Electoral College. And that is a chance for people who are sad about the outcome to say, this election isn't fair. And this worries me. It worries me in 1860 because it allowed Southern states to say, I'm not going to be governed by this guy that we didn't vote for. And it worries me today because we sometimes have people who don't win popular votes appointing 5 years worth of Supreme Court justices in just 4 years, for example. But anyone have a question about this? I love this topic.
I think we're good.
Okay, outstanding. And any other questions for me?
I've got a couple that are queued up that I'm going to bring in at the very end, but I want you to work through the rest of your slides here.
So the rest of my slides are only if people are interested. So okay, good. So I'll show a couple of slides. Here is a map that I wanted to contrast because it shows that reversal of the 1860 map. I'll toggle between them. The red states on the top of the map, the blue states on the bottom. Here's the Mitt Romney Barack Obama election just 8 years ago, where that same area that voted for Lincoln votes for Obama. also coincidentally from Illinois, also coincidentally someone who no one thought would be a factor in the 2008 election unless you really were following politics, and the red states in the South. And remember, Florida in 2020, Obama won by basically 0.5% in 2012. The next slide I have here is the 2016 election, which you see why Hillary Clinton lost that election so much. She did not keep those states that Obama won, the Wisconsins, the Michigans, the Pennsylvanias, and the Floridas. Allowing Trump to win narrow victories in those states made the Electoral College victory for Trump, which he will be the first person to tell you he won by a lot in the Electoral College. I think he says that just about every time he speaks. And then finally, I have a slide of this morning. If the polls, or I would say the average of the polls, is to be believed, and I'm not sure it is or they are, what would happen if the election was held today? And you see how interesting that map is. You have Biden having 259 electoral votes that are in either leaning states or secure states, and you have Trump with 125 electoral votes in states that are leaning Republican or strong in the Republican, with a full 154 electoral votes worth of states undecided as of now. And to me, the most important thing to look at is that those undecided states don't just include perennial battleground state or doubtful state Pennsylvania. They include North Carolina, where Andy is. They include Georgia. They include Texas and Arizona. Is Biden going to win Texas? No, I don't think he is. But is Texas going to be in play in the future? I think it is. Trump only won it by 5 points 4 years ago. And I think our electoral map is about to be scrambled again as we go forward into the next decade. I don't know if it's going to yield us a new political party, like that outstanding question earlier, but it could. And we're going to have a real sense of a scrambling of the electoral map as we go into the 2020s and 2030s. And that is the end of my talk. I'm going to shut up and I'm going to open things to questions.
Yeah, we've got all kinds of questions. One of which I'm going to bring together 2 or 3 questions as one. It seems like there's particular interest around one question. But before we get there, can you give us a sense? You know, one of the struggles of historians, one of the good struggles of historians and history teachers, is to impart to our younger students that everything is present tense. And when you wake up in the morning and you put your feet on the floor, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. So just as we don't know what's going to happen in 2 weeks in our election, in September of 1860, what were the primary issues on my mind when my feet hit the floor before the election? What were the things that motivated how people cast their ballot?
That's a central question. So it really depends on where you are. If you are a member of the Republican Party, you feel like this is finally a chance to put a check on the power of slaveholders. And I'm going to get to Margie's question on my screen now about the 3/5 compromise. If you are a Republican in 1860, you feel like for the last 75 years, your democracy has been hijacked by a very small number of powerful slaveholding men. And this was your chance, finally, to right the ship of state. It's because people had moved to the United States in gigantic numbers. An entire new middle class had spread across the Midwest and finally found a way to make a popular check on the seemingly limitless power of Southern slaveholders. Think about before 1860. Slaveholders dominated all 3 branches of government. They were the Speaker of the House for 3/4 of the years. They were the president for 3/4 of the time. And even when they weren't the president, even when there was a Northern president like Martin Van Buren or John Adams, they won 1 term and that was it. They were a gigantic majority in the Supreme Court. Look at that Dred Scott versus Stanford decision. It was such a victory for slaveholders. It basically said that every dream belief of slaveholders was enshrined in the Constitution. Black people can't be citizens. You don't get freed if you're a slave by traveling to places like Minnesota Territory. Everything that slaveholders were dreaming of was in that Dred Scott decision. If you were a Southerner, I think there was a lot of trepidation, Andy. If you were a Southerner, if you were someone who believed in the Union, if you were a constitutional unionist or a Douglas Southerner, you thought that this election was hopefully going to put someone like Douglas there who could keep the country together, but you were wildly apprehensive about the rise of a radical pro-slavery secessionist movement that was embodied by the Breckinridge voters. And again, they did not accept the results of the election, and they quit the country as a result of it. So if you're Yancey, if you're William Lowndes Yancey, if you're William Barnwell Rhett, you're hoping in some ways that Lincoln wins, because then you can take your marbles and go home and start a new country that is free of John Brown radicals and abolitionists.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Thank you. Talk to us a little bit too about, as Ginger Park asks, Ginger, I'm super glad that you're safe in Fort Collins from the fires. Tell us about the role of the census in both the 1860 and perhaps even more contemporary elections.
I was not expecting a census question, but it's hugely important. So obviously, this is another year in 1860 where they're going to be doing a census. But all of the census stuff that leads to the 1860 election is from the 1850 census. And the 1850s are a huge decade for immigration, one of the largest decades for immigration in American history. So the map is different than the reality in 1860 is different than the census maps in 1850. And I would argue the same is potentially true here. There has been so much change since 2010 and since folks when I was last at the National Humanities Council, we've had all sorts of things happening. So the census is how we apportion electoral votes then and now. And you can see in this, I'm going to go back to our 1860 map. You can see the states that have the most electoral votes. New York has 35 electoral votes. Florida has 3. Winning Pennsylvania and winning New York is a huge part of the battle if you're running for office. It's almost not worth trying to get Oregon and California, although it's nice to have 7 electoral votes as gravy. But the big states are those middle Atlantic states. Those are the ones that have almost all the votes, and that's why you see Lincoln pouring his attention into places like Pennsylvania and Indiana. Those are really rich states because of the electoral votes granted by the decennial census count in 1850.
And does that also then qualify or quantify the eligible voters, of which there were not many in the Blue South?
That is a great question also. So to be an eligible voter, it's both very easy to become a voter and very hard to become a voter depending on who you are. If you are a white person, a white man, and you're coming from Germany or Ireland, where many of the immigrants are in Germany, where many of the immigrants are coming from in the 1840s, you're going to be voting very quickly. It depends on what state. Sometimes it's 18 months, sometimes it's 2 years, but there are rapid naturalization programs in most states that end up yielding immigrants as voters if you're a man. If you're a black person or if you're a woman, you're not going to be voting. So, which is important to keep in mind. All these voters I'm talking about are white men over the age of 21. So in some ways, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I'm sorry. I interrupted you, please.
I want people to also remember, a lot of times when we talk about the age of Jackson, we're talking about it as racist and a small electorate just basing the franchise on adult white males. That's true. Another way to look at it, the Jacksonian period is the largest widening of the franchise in the history of the planet either. More people could vote and more poor people could vote and more diverse people could vote than ever before, even though, yes, they were all white guys, but you didn't have to own property in most states. You could have just been, your English could be very poor. You could have just stepped off the boat months before from Ireland and been a voter in New York State.
Great point. One of the questions that's come up quite a bit in the chat box and in the Ask Professor Earl box, you might have just answered, or maybe we can weave those two together, and that is, you showed 2 maps, 1860, then a more contemporary map, and essentially the colors flipped with a little bit of variance.
Yep.
Tell us, several people have asked what you think the marker is for that change. And then my follow-up question is, does it have anything to do with the fact that different and more people are voting now than did in 1860?
Those are great questions, and I will answer them very quickly. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's when you see the beginning of a radical change in who's a Democrat in the South and who's a Republican in the South. I live in Louisiana. There were no Republicans here in 1965. Some black people, but most blacks in my hometown of Baton Rouge were already Democrats by then. And it took a generation. Famously, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, remarked that we've just lost the South for a generation. We'll see if he is right. Maybe it's more than a generation. But let me give you an example. I have a senator in Louisiana. His name is John Neely Kennedy. You might see him on TV. He pretends, even though he has a degree from Vanderbilt and another one from Oxford, that he's kind of like a foghorn leghorn. He has an accident. He speaks in these kind of homespun Southern yarns. He was a Kerry surrogate in 2004. Now he's one of Trump's most loyal supporters in 2020. Louisiana was very slow to make this change that we see on these maps. And it's been profound. It is basically Democrats were assumed to be the party that backed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, allowing African Americans to vote unfettered in the South, and white Southerners switched parties as a result.
Yeah, fantastic. Last question goes to Monica over in Durham, and Monica's wondering, when you started tonight, you mentioned that people have often felt as if the upcoming election is the end of days. I don't use that term lightly now in the COVID world we live in, but both then and now that the opposing candidates are talking about the end of democracy if the other wins. And of course, that did happen in 1861 and forward.
Yeah.
Certainly, there were struggles in the growth of the American democracy. Jonathan, are you optimistic in terms of the health of our democracy? What conversation are we going to have in a handful of years, regardless of the outcome?
I would love to have a second chapter of this webinar with these teachers, because I want to hear what their students are saying, what they're telling their students. So I gave a similar talk to this 4 years ago when I first. It's much better now. So if you didn't like it, it was terrible 4 years ago. Where I really set out a lot of confidence and beliefs in our institutions to hold even a Trump presidency. And I'm not saying, look, I'm kind of a liberal here in Louisiana, but in other places I've lived, I would have been much more moderate. I am concerned that there is so much division in the country, and I do liken some of what I hear some supporters of the president say to fire eaters, and that worries me. However, I do believe in our institutions. I do think that let's cross our fingers that the election is going to be free and fairly held. I do think that people are going to be able to vote freely. I do think the Electoral College is going to work this time, whoever wins. So I'm kind of an optimist in terms of institutions, but we are under, as a democracy and as a country, a lot of stress. And I want this to be a very simple election. I would almost hope that we can have a winner declared on the evening of election eve, not wait for a week, because once the courts get involved and once protests start happening and once, I'm going to go back, if I could just spend a second talking about Margie's question from the very beginning. She talks about institutions like the Wide Awakes. The Wide Awakes were young men who, they didn't have AK-47s, but they had torches and they sometimes had muskets, and they paraded around with Republican candidates like Lincoln. And they scared the bejesus out of Southerners who saw these supporters of Lincoln as potentially militias who could endanger their freedom. And now, of course, we have militias threatening to, I believe their verb is to take sitting governors and put them on trial. That stuff does keep me up at night, I will admit. But you know what? We're Americans. We've done this for 240 years, and I think we're going to be okay. Is that a positive enough note to end on?
Jonathan, I think the question mark is a period. It's an exclamation point. Thank you.
God bless America. God bless all you for being here tonight.
Jonathan Earl, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate your insights, and I will be adding the recording and the PowerPoint to the digital library so teachers can spend more time lingering with it. Jonathan, thanks so much.
I appreciate everyone here tonight. Thanks, Andy.